As Magic's earliest set, many of Alpha's cards are unplayable by current standards, while other cards like the infamous Power 9 are so broken that they don't see play in anything but Vintage. Today, we're going to be looking at cards from Alpha that were not only powerful, but remain staples in the game to this day. Starting us off at number 10, we have Wrath of God. This sorcery costs 2 generic and 2 white mana and destroys all creatures. They can't be regenerated. Regenerate is a keyword that used to be evergreen, but now has been phased out of use. It was a replacement effect that replaced the next time a permanent would be destroyed that turn with tapping it, removing all damage from it, and removing it from combat. Regenerate was a way to save a creature from destruction, and in turn, Wrath of God prevented that ability from working. While this text is far from relevant today, there was a time where Regenerate was common, and this line of text would help to answer it. But even beyond this line of text, Wrath of God remains a playable card, and an important one too. Despite being the very first board wipe, and the reason board wipes are often called Wraths, it also remains far stronger than most printed after it. This is in part because Wrath of God is the basis on which most other board wipes effects are based on or compared to. Cards like Damnation serve as direct homages to the original board wipe, while other Wraths have their mana value and abilities determined by the template Wrath of God established. Ever since its printing, sorcery speed board wipes generally are printed with a mana value of 4 or more. Bontu's Last Reckoning costs less mana, but comes with a steep drawback of preventing you from untapping your lands on the next turn. Wraths that cost a higher mana value often come with bonus effects or ways to lower their mana value conditionally. While experimentation in the design space has led to new playable board wipes like Supreme Verdict, Wrath of God remains the arguable gold standard of board wipes. Every time a new one is printed, the first point of comparison is with Wrath of God in terms of power and efficiency. While it certainly is less of a presence than it used to be, Wrath of God does still appear in modern deck lists to this day. Formats like Legacy tend to value more niche but easier to abuse Wrath effects like Terminus. And Commander is home to all kinds of board wipes, Wrath of God included. Many of Alpha's mana values were far off from what you'd see today. Ancestral Recall drew way too many cards for too little mana, and most creatures cost far too much for how bad they are when compared to modern creatures. However, Wrath of God's power and effect were so perfectly balanced that it remains the standard by which all Wraths are created and judged. And at number 9 on this list, we have Sol Ring. This artifact costs 1 generic mana and taps for 2 generic mana. Sol Ring is one of the few mana-producing artifacts that are positive in mana production that do not enter tapped. This, coupled with its mana value of 1, allows you to not only cast Sol Ring to develop your mana, but then cast another colorless spell on the same turn, functionally giving you access to 3 mana on turn 1. For comparison, Warm Power Stone not only enters the battlefield tapped, but also costs 3 mana, yet produces the same amount of mana as Sol Ring. It is far and away one of the most powerful pieces of mana acceleration ever printed, only dwarfed by Black Lotus and the other artifacts in the Power 9. But while those Power 9 cards are all banned for most formats and cost prohibitive prices to a point where most players will never cast them, Sol Ring is one of the most commonly played cards in the game. Commander is Magic's most popular format, and is notably one of the few formats where Sol Ring is legal. As such, Sol Ring is something of a symbol of the format to a point where it has been printed in every Commander precon that has been sold. This has kept its price low enough and the card ubiquitous enough that it is undeniably the most played card in the format. Decks in Commander have to specifically have a reason to not run Sol Ring, usually due to the deck not running artifacts for one reason or another. But even decks that tend to run Artifact Hate will usually run Sol Ring on the off chance it helps them cast their important cards faster. Even without an immediate follow-up on the turn you cast it, Sol Ring puts you ahead on mana better than just about any other singular mana rock in the game. Admittedly, Sol Ring does not see play in many other formats, which is part of why it's solo on this list. However, that's because Sol Ring isn't legal in those other formats. Vintage is the only other format that allows for Sol Ring, and even then it's restricted to just 1 copy. While it's not as much of a competitive staple as other cards on this list, its ubiquity in Commander is more than enough to earn it a spot on the list. And at number 8, we have Animate Dead. This enchantment costs 1 generic and 1 black for an aura that enchants a creature card in the graveyard. When Animate Dead enters the battlefield, the creature in the graveyard returns to the battlefield enchanted by Animate Dead. The creature gets -1 power, and whenever Animate Dead leaves the battlefield, the creature's controller sacrifices it. Beyond being notable for its rather complicated effects text to make the ability to work within Magic's rules, Animate Dead is one of the most powerful reanimation spells ever printed. Reanimation effects at this low of mana value tend to be rather limited, whereas for just 2 mana you can reanimate a creature in either graveyard with the only drawback coming in the form of a small stat reduction. While this means you're able to take your opponent's creatures from the graveyard, the more standard line of play involves reviving your own creatures. Dedicated reanimator decks will find a way to put powerful creatures in the graveyard, then revive them with a spell that costs far less than the game-ending threat you just revived. A swamp followed by a dark ritual is enough mana for you to cast a spell Entomb to put any creature in the graveyard and still have enough mana to revive that creature with Animate Dead on the first turn. Reanimate is a more efficient spell at just 1 mana, but also loses you life equal to that creature's mana value, which can be dangerous if your threat is answered. Animate Dead is still extremely low mana value and, more notably, doesn't drain your life total. This leads to Animate Dead being a more generically playable card and not just used in reanimator strategies. Black decks in Legacy may opt to run 1 or 2 copies to not only give their own threats more longevity, but to potentially use your opponent's creatures against them. Beyond this, there's even combo potential with cards like Leonin Relic Warden and World Gorger Dragon, able to go infinite with the card thanks to the specific templating of their abilities. Animate Dead sees a good deal of play in Legacy as well as in Commander, yet is not legal in many other formats. And at number 7, we have Demonic Tutor. This sorcery costs 1 generic and 1 black mana and searches your library for any card, puts it into your hand, then shuffles your library. Demonic Tutor was the game's first propic generic search effect. One so powerful that to this day, we refer to spells that search for other cards as tutors. Not only is this because future search spells would use the same naming convention, but also thanks to Demonic Tutor's sheer strength. Diabolic Tutor costs twice as much mana to do the same effect and is generally considered the fairer cost for this spell. Demonic Tutor's low mana value makes it a relevant card at basically every stage of the game, since it's easy to cast and can be traded for whatever specific card you need at the moment. They can search up the exact piece of removal you might need for a situation, or even find the color of land you're missing in a pinch. Search effects since have either raised the mana value or have some form of drawback or restriction that limits their function. Meanwhile, Demonic Tutor is just an aggressively costed search effect that has no limits whatsoever. The card is so powerful that it isn't legal in many formats, banned in Legacy, and not even eligible for inclusion in most other formats. Vintage and Commander are its main homes, although it's undeniably one of the strongest spells in both formats. Given Commander is built in Highlander style and Vintage has many cards restricted to 1 copy on the ban list, Diabolic Tutor represents redundancy where you would otherwise wouldn't have it. Diabolic Tutor can be the second copy of not just your strongest card, but any other card you might need to react to your opponent or close out the game. It's an extremely powerful effect, only so low on this list because it's not legal in as many formats and thus is harder to say a true staple. However, if Diabolic Tutor were legal in those formats, it would certainly be a staple there too, like it currently is in Commander and Vintage. And at number 6, we have Swords to Plowshares. This instant costs 1 white mana and exiles target creature. Its controller gains life equal to its power. An easy way to put Swords to Plowshares into context is to compare it to Murder, one of the most ubiquitous and long-lived removal spells in Magic. For 3 mana, Murder can destroy any creature at instant speed. Swords to Plowshares, on the other hand, not only costs less mana, but it exiles the creature. While there are plenty of ways to reanimate a creature that died and went to the graveyard, the means of bringing something back from exile are much more limited. As such, Swords to Plowshares is both more efficient and powerful than something like Murder. The only real downside to the spell is that it gains the opponent life. Giving someone even 8 extra life off of Swords to Plowshares is rarely a problem, since that creature will usually represent a lot more threat or damage over the course of several turns if left unanswered. It's easier to just give the opponent the life and control the board state than try and race your opponent more conventionally. It's arguably the strongest removal spell ever printed. The cards explicitly designed to be weaker versions of Swords to Plowshares wind up so good they become staples in their own right. In Legacy, it remains the cleanest answer to most of the format's most problematic threats. Combo decks built around Dark Depths focus on cheating out the massive token that cannot be destroyed and winning the game with it. Swords to Plowshares is efficient removal that is actually able to kill the Meritage token that is otherwise almost unstoppable. Even though your opponent gains 20 life, you've disrupted their main game plan and thus have plenty more time to assemble a win of your own and chew through all that extra life you just gave them. If the card were ever printed into Modern, it would instantly become the most powerful removal spell in that format. Its lack of presence in formats like that does keep it from appearing higher in this list. However, there's no denying that Swords to Plowshares remains one of the most important and powerful removal options ever made, not to mention the best white removal spell in every format it's legal in. And at number 5, we have Birds of Paradise. This bird costs 1 green mana, has 0 power and 1 toughness, as well as the keyword flying. This makes it so that it can only be blocked by creatures with flying or reach. You can tap Birds of Paradise to add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool. Ever since the earliest days of Magic, the idea of playing spells that give you access to more mana to cast more expensive spells has been popular and powerful. While Alpha is best known for its artifact forms of mana ramp, it is also home to the first creatures that tapped for mana. These mana dorks are a prominent style of creature to this day, with many various tweaks and altercations to cost and effect. Unsurprisingly, the best forms of mana ramp are the ones you can cast the fastest, seeing as how the goal is to get ahead on mana as soon as you can. Birds of Paradise allows you to start your second turn with access to 3 mana, and from there it gives you room to start deploying threats or continue to develop your mana. Birds of Paradise in particular was powerful thanks to being able to tap for any color. This meant that not only did Birds of Paradise increase your overall mana count, it gave you the ability to cast spells with more specific mana costs. Birds of Paradise's low mana value and mana flexibility has led it to still seen playing formats like Modern Commander to this day. While other mana dorks can sometimes offer more utility, Birds of Paradise is generally more flexible and can even be an aerial blocker in a pinch. One could also argue the spawn on this list could go to Llanowar Elves, which also costs 1 green mana. It only taps for green mana, yet has more power and is an elf, which is a more relevant creature type. Llanowar Elves still sees play in dedicated elf-themed decks that want to play as many elves as possible. Those decks are often mono-green as well, meaning the other colors of mana Birds of Paradise provides aren't relevant. As such, these 2 mana dorks from Alpha both appear in decks in respective formats, especially thanks to Birds of Paradise not being legal in Pioneer like Llanowar Elves is. And at number 4, we have the original dual lands. Alpha included a cycle of 10 lands, 1 for each 2-color combination of colors, although Volcanic Island was left out of the initial set due to an error and was later included in beta. These lands have 2 basic land types and thus tap for 2 colors, like with Taiga being a forest mountain and thus tapping for red and green. There's also no restrictions that make them enter tapped, which sets them apart from the likes of Ravnica's Shocklands, which also have basic land types. This makes these original dual lands not only strong lands to draw and play in the early turns, but the best lands to search with fetch lands. Fetch lands are lands that can be sacrificed to search a land, usually searching a specific basic land type. This means Windswept Heath, which can search for a forest or plains, is able to search potentially multiple duals, like the aforementioned Taiga or a plains like Badlands. This allows formats like Legacy, which have access to both cycles of lands, to search for lands they need on demand instead of hoping they draw for the right colors. Fetches also allows you to slightly thin your deck, removing more lands from the deck and increasing the likelihood of drawing non-land cards. While other lands work with fetch lands, the fact that these original dual lands enter untapped is what truly sets them apart. Most often, the cost for greedy multicolor mana bases is having to do with lands that enter tapped or finding ways to circumvent that. These original duals allow you to maintain tempo by developing your colors while still having access to that mana immediately. As such, they are universally considered among the strongest lands ever printed, and mainstays in every format they're legal in. They're such an integral part of formats like Legacy and Vintage that decks run multiple copies of Wasteland because many times opponents just won't have many, if any, basic lands. And that's to say nothing of Commander, where the most optimized mana bases run as many fetch lands as they can, and by extension want to access as many powerful duals as possible. In the years since, while we've seen more lands with basic land typing and more lands with abilities to enter untapped conditionally, nothing matches the sheer simplicity and power of the original duals. And at number 3, we have Dark Ritual. This instant costs 1 black mana and adds 3 black mana. While on paper, this may seem like just a temporary net gain of 2 mana, in practice, that alone is enough for it to be one of the most powerful mana acceleration effects of all time. Like many other cards on this list, Dark Ritual is the namesake for a whole variety of cards. Any instant or sorcery that gives you more mana than you paid to cast it is generally referred to as a ritual. In decks built around speeding towards a specific card or playing the game as fast as possible, rituals allow you to trade a card for a burst of mana. In the earliest days of Magic, this was used to get a turn 1 Hypnotic Spectre, which at the time could run away with the game on its own. As the game progressed, Dark Ritual's power only grew. 3 black mana just so happened to be the exact mana cost of Necropotence, allowing decks quick and consistent access to a card that was typically difficult to cast, but could dominate an entire game with the card advantage it provides. Dark Ritual's most consistent home, however, is in spell-oriented combo decks like Storm. Dark Ritual not only counts as a spell cast, but can help provide the mana to draw more cards, or eventually pay for the cost of one of the higher mana value Storm spells. The card is notably a common, which gives the Pauper format access to the spell as well. Given the general lack of mana-efficient threats in Pauper, Dark Ritual is often used to turbo into threats like the now banned Underdark Explorer. Legacy and Vintage are where it truly shines, however. Storm variants in both formats have relied on the card for years, and have found even more uses for it thanks to the introduction of Beseech the Mirror to the format, allowing for blistering fast turn 1 wins if you have 2 Dark Rituals and Beseech the Mirror in hand. It's one of the most iconic spells ever printed, and a backbone for all combo decks since they've existed in Magic. And coming in number 2, we have Counterspell. This instant costs 2 blue mana and counters target spell. Another namesake, the first Counterspell remains one of the most aggressively costed of its kind. The going rate for a catch-all counterspell that can counter any kind of spell is 3 mana. Sometimes these spells will have bonus effects or alternate casting methods, but generally speaking, catch-all counterspells are not 2 mana without some form of restriction or drawback. Most counterspells that cost 2 mana these days tend to only be able to hit a certain mana value spell, or a certain card type. While these spells are often easier to cast in the double blue of Counterspell, they will have scenarios where they're dead, whereas Counterspell will always have something it can target usually. This is another example of Alpha setting another gold standard by which an entire card type is compared and classified. And unlike some other examples, Counterspell has proven to be a fairly balanced option for many of Magic's formats, given their general speed and the power spells played with 2 or 3 mana these days. While not legal in Pioneer or Standard and unlikely to ever be printed into those formats, it remains a healthy card in control decks in essentially every other format. While perhaps not the best counterspell in the game, given there are more narrow counterspells that have a lot more power, it's certainly one of the most prominent and ubiquitous. From Vintage to Pauper, if a deck is aiming to counter spells, it will most likely have some copies of the original counterspell included. While the double blue cost does make it somewhat restrictive, that hasn't done much to keep it from being one of the most widely played pieces of counter magic in Commander either. Being able to counter anything for minimal mana investment is the most important part of playing a control strategy. You need to be able to counter as many things as you can while also having mana available for other plays. The more efficient and more powerful a counterspell, the better it is. And this leaves Counterspell at the perfect intersection of mana value efficiency to effect potency. And finally, for number 1, we have a Lightning Bolt. This instant costs 1 red mana and deals 3 damage to any target. Lightning Bolt remains to this day one of the most efficient burn spells ever printed. Standard is forced to play Shock at the exact same mana value, and even Pioneer's best burn spells often are spells that can be a Lightning Bolt if you meet the right conditions. While there are other 1 mana spells that deal 3 damage like Lava Spike, these cards are often limited to what they can target. Some can target players and planeswalkers, others can target creatures, but very few spells can do as much as Bolt to do anything for 1 mana. This allows Lightning Bolt to essentially be a modal card that doubles as removal as much as it does on life total pressure. Many of the strongest creatures in the game happen to die to Lightning Bolt, with the phrase Bolt the Bird being ubiquitous with using your cheap burn spell to kill the valuable small creature. While not legal in Pioneer, Historic, or Standard, it remains the hallmark burn spell in essentially every other format. Dedicated burn decks that try to deal 20 damage to your opponent as fast as possible rely on a playset of Lightning Bolt to represent over half your opponent's starting life total in just 4 mana of damage. Even decks not dedicated wholly to burn opt to run Lightning Bolt. While Swords to Plowshares is undeniably a more powerful piece of removal, that doesn't mean Lightning Bolt doesn't shred through most of Legacy's most notable threats. Considering that competitive Magic is built around efficient threats with low toughness, it's common that Lightning Bolt generally will be enough to handle most things. And even when Lightning Bolt can't be used to clear creatures, it can represent surprise direct damage to your opponent. Someone might make plays that allow them to survive one way that leaves them dead to a Lightning Bolt that you had in hand. It allows relatively simplistic aggressive decks to have a lot more depth in play and piloting, where you leave your opponent guessing with just how much damage you can represent from your hand at any given time. Lightning Bolt is such an iconic burn spell that the set that printed into modern format was seen as a momentous occasion. While perhaps not the outright strongest spell on this list, it is perhaps the most definitive staple on the list. Never broken, prominent in several formats big and small, and the benchmark of an entire variety of spells. Alright, and that's the list. Are there any other staple cards from the past early days that you think were worth an inclusion? Or do you have any ideas for future topics you'd like to see discussed? If so, let us know down in the comments below.